I will not read you the bio blurb you have access to, but essential thing right now is that he's a non-resident senior fellow at AEI, having gone there. Well, he may describe why he went there after being at the Center for American Progress for many years, and he's the current. I think of him as the founder and editor, but maybe just some other title of The Liberal Patriot, which is a great online magazine. And he's recently started the Liberal Patriot podcast, which I really recommend to all of you. Liberal Patriot podcast and rag. I've known Ruy for, I don't know, almost 30 years now. Is that possible?
I think it's more than that.
All right.
Close to
a long time.
Long time.
And we immediately connected. He, as Adrian noted, was a graduate here, worked with Eric and other people here coming from Michigan. And we overlapped very briefly at Yale, but didn't have any sightings the second time before they asked you to leave.
Not that we remember. I might have seen you, but I was too stoned, you know?
Right. That was his Yale career.
Pretty much.
Summed up. You know, we've written a bunch of things together, worked on different projects together, including a book, which my the fellow staff at the Haven Center did not note in his bio, but which I think was a pretty good book, called The Forgotten Majority. And what we'll be talking about today is the sort of the reappearance of that majority. David Shore recently pointed out that if everybody had voted, everyone who was eligible to vote in America had voted in the last election, Trump's share would have been about 55%. I mean, that's very close to a landslide. So that's the situation that we're in now. But Ruy, together, he's a very full character. He's got a very full life. Intellectually, though, I consider him more or less unsurpassed in the combination of real empirical interest and mastery and theoretical interest and you know, very, very strong moral values. He is, you know, as the French like to say, un homme de la gauche. They say it better than I. He's definitely a man of the left, or a person of the left. And you'll hear that in everything he says. But he never overclaims or tries never to overclaim. He's tutored by the evidence in a really rigorous way. If you ever want to know about any obscure leftist debate that's happened in the long, sad history of socialism, talk to Ruy. He'll take you in and out of the, you know, every formation you could possibly imagine. But also, if you ever want a good recommendation on a good science fiction novel, he's a master of that. If you want to go down to spring training sometime, he'll be there. He's got a very full life. He's a devoted family guy. We were just talking about his kids yesterday, blah, blah, blah. So here, the man in full, and on the left, Ruy Teixeira.
Well, thank you, Joel, for that extremely generous introduction. And it's certainly a pleasure to be here at the Havens Right Center. I'm honored to be able to give this lecture. You know, I spent quite a lot of time here in Wisconsin. I was here 78 days before. For my PhD, I worked a lot with Eric Wright, a number of other people here, as Joel mentioned. It was a formative intellectual time for me, and just great. I mean, you know, in between, you know, sitting out on the terrace with a pitcher of beer, I did try to get a lot of work done, and I think it was pretty productive. But I tried to continue in the vein of, kind of as Joel was alluding to, trying to combine some sort of serious theoretical questioning of things with rigorous empirics. And I proceeded to do that over the course of my career, wending my way through the Washington think tank world and desperately trying to tell people on the left particularly in the Democratic Party, about some of the things they might be missing. Some of the things they're probably not thinking about. Some of the things that are preventing them from vanquishing their foes and really doing what this country needs to have done. So my lecture today is possible futures of the Democratic Party, particularly obviously coming off the 2024 election, which could have gone a lot better for the Democrats. There's this guy named Trump who's now president, and I think that is not to the liking of most people on the left, and indeed many people in the center, but there it is, he won. And other bad things happen as well. So, how does this happen? How does Trump win 2 out of 3 elections from the Democrats? How did we get here in 2024, now 2025? I'll try to explain a little bit of that in the course of talking about possible futures for the Democratic Party. So first slide, please. First slide, it talks about the first future I'm going to talk about, which is continued decline of the Democratic Party. So let's dig in to some of the things that might indicate and talk about that trend. So next slide. Okay, this is data from Nate Cohn of the New York Times. He's probably one of the best data analysts out there, and they have a lot of firepower at the time, so they can do a lot of serious and significant synthetic data analysis. And this is a piece, this is a picture, a graph from Hamill from a piece he wrote maybe like 3 weeks ago, maybe a little bit more than that. Anyway, this is what happened in 2024, and how does this relate to where things have been in the past? And the big message from this is these are all groups that have shifted very significantly Republican since the time of Barack Obama. So this, basically 2012, 2024, there are other estimates you can get here, but the story's basically the same. And you note that blacks have moved toward the Democrats by 19 margin points, Hispanics by 29, Asians by 17, and other by 17. So that kind of starts to undercut just a little bit the concept that as America becomes more non-white, that will inevitably benefit the Democrats in a big way. And all they've got to do is sort of sit around and mobilize those voters and everything will be dandy. So let's see the next slide. Now, this is really the heart of it in a way, because a lot of the problems here have to do with the working class in general. Now, you can see that non-whites, even college graduates, have been moving toward the Republicans, but we know that whites, already a terrible group with no degree, by working class voters, already a terrible group for the Democrats. They really hammered Hillary Clinton in 2016. That's why basically Trump won. And they continued to be solidly anti-democratic. And in the last election, according to Cohn's analysis, there was a 36-point Republican margin. That indicates, of course, a significant shift from 2012. But look at this, non-white working class voters. This is really key, because this is what, more than anything else, is basically undercutting Democrat strength with non-white voters. Because even though there's also been a shift among the college graduates in that group, maybe like 75% of non-whites are working class or non-college. So this is really what's driving the trend away from the Democrats. You're going from plus 64 in 2012 to a mere plus 27 in this last election, the 37-point margin shift. So that has really undercut the Democrats everywhere, where there's a significant minority vote that they've been relying upon. Now, here's another indicator of weakness, which is important to think about, which is young voters. Young voters were supposed to be, the future of the Democrats, and therefore a good future, because as newer cohorts come into the electorate and lean heavily Democratic, they will they will replace the older voters exiting the other end. And inevitably, paradise will arrive because everyone will be a Democrat. But that's not quite how it's working out, because you could see in this election, Democrats have only had an 11-point margin with voters under 30. And that wasn't supposed to happen, because voters under 30 are supposed to hate Donald Trump and hate the Republicans. But oddly, they did a lot better in this election. What's that about? And that's something. And interesting, one thing to note about this cohort, 18 to 29 and 24, they're primarily Gen Z voters, right? And there's a lot of data that tend to show that Gen Z voters are uniformly more conservative, no matter what subgroup you look at, than voters who are in the millennial generation. So millennials were famously quite pro-democratic and been somewhat stable in their orientation. But the Gen Z folks are kind of a different ball of wax. They really are more conservative in almost every respect in every subgroup. So that's significant. Let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, so this is some data based on AP North Votecast, which is the best immediate post-election survey that's available, way better than the exit polls. And just the interesting thing here is plus 15 Democratic for men under 30 to plus 14 for Trump in 2024. So you're going 4-year difference, 2020, 2024. You got almost a 30-point shift for Trump. But here's a really interesting thing, right? It was plus 32 for women under 30 in 2020, and it's only plus 18 in this last election. So that's like a 14-point shift, about half, only half the shift to the men, but it's still a big shift. This wasn't supposed to happen because women under 30, we know that they're more liberal than men. We know there's been a general tendency of younger women to adopt liberal ideology and also to be animated by the abortion issue. It's supposed to be the magic elixir for the Democrats coming off of the 2022 election and other specials after that. But it didn't work. They actually moved very significantly toward the Republicans and toward Donald Trump. So that's another trend to think about, that these cohorts that are coming into the electorate are just not nearly as reliably Democratic as the cohorts that preceded them. And that undercuts, in a sense, a lot of the Democratic theory of the case. So let's look at the next one. Okay, this shows the good side of the force, or somewhat aspects that are good. You can see there are a few groups that have become more Democratic. White voters, right? They're saving the Democrats. And here's really saving the Democrats: white college graduates. While every other group that the Democrats are relying upon as double-digit moves away from the Democrats, white college graduates are moving in the opposite direction very rapidly, and now are giving the Democrats pretty solid margins over the Republicans in almost every election, and they did in this last one as well. So it's really, actually, if you look at the 2020 election, it's pretty clear that white college graduates are who delivered the election for Donald Trump, for Joe Biden, despite all the other things people said. It was really about these voters, and they delivered again for the Democrats in 2024. The problem is all this other stuff went the other way and canceled it out, more than canceled it out. So Patrick Ruffini, whose book I recommend you, he's a Republican analyst, but he's very, very good. He has a book called Party of the People Inside the Populist, Multiracial Populist Coalition Remaking the Republican Party. But he remarked that you can look across a wide range of demographics. And one of the only demographics you can find since the 2012 election that's moved toward the Democrats is white college graduates. Other groups, other subgroups, by and large, have not done so. So that's a very important fact. So let's take a look at the next slide. So what's this all about? Look, put it in a very much broader context. I hope some of you are familiar with the Thomas Piketty and colleagues' work on political power and social cleavages. There's a big book they put out with a wide variety of country-specific surveys of voting trends over time. And they put together an enormous amount of data, and one can quibble, I suppose, about exactly how they do this. And I tried to find a chart that was outdated past 2016. I'll just tell you what happened after that. But you can see the general message here is right at the top, from the worker party to the higher education party. That really is the story of the Democratic Party writ large in the last 40, 50 years. And as you can see, this margin, college graduates minus non-college graduates, both from being quite pro-democratic, but quite, fairly pro-Republican in terms of what the margin means. So right now, you see this about a 14-point margin in 2016, between the high education, low education voters. This blue one is these are all controls, but the blue one is just the raw differential. So if you extended this out to 2024, and I have the data, it would be literally off this chart. The margin, the differential about doubles between high education and low education voters. So in other words, in 2020, 2024, education polarization, which is the story of this chart, actually becomes much more severe and is literally double and off the chart, this particular one. So Piketty frequently talks about this, and I do too, picking up the term, the Democrats becoming a Brahmin left party, where working class voters are increasingly unrepresented and higher education, more affluent voters are increasingly represented and paid attention to. And I really do think that is a big part of the story of how the Democrats are in the pickle they are today. It's hard to be the working class party when you're actually a Brahmin left party. It's hard to be a working class party when more working class voters vote for the other party than do for you. So it kind of confuses our image and skews our priorities in a lot of different ways. So let's take a look at the next slide. So these are a series of charts I just think are fun to look at from John Bird Murdoch of the Financial Times. If you're interested in serious data analytics from a media company, I think Bird Murdoch and Cohn too, but Bird Murdoch is one of the best. And this shows a racial realignment, non-white voters shifting away from the Democrats and toward the Republicans. And as you can see, it goes pretty far back in terms of the general trend all the way back to the 60s and 70s, but it really starts spiking around here. And again, you can see this margin here is maybe a little bit too close, but it's still quite significant how that difference between Democratic voting and Republican voting among non-white voters overall has really radically declined. The Democratic advantage from non-white voters has radically declined in general over that time period and in the last election. And of course, what that means is you continue to have a mixed effect of pro-Democratic racial groups, at least still pro-Democratic racial groups, becoming a larger share of voters. But the pro-Democratic effect of that mix effect is completely canceled out by what we might call the within-cell changes between various big groups in the Democratic coalition. In other words, if non-whites are becoming much more Republican, even though they're still lean Democratic and there's more of them, the net of those two things is bad for the Democrats. So let's see the next slide. And this is another chart from Bird Murdoch. It just shows that if you disaggregate non-white voters, you see blacks and especially Latinos are following that trend of ceasing to identify as closely with the Democrats. And this is all non-whites over here. Yeah, so whoops. Yeah, no, go to the next slide. That's good because this is really important slide because it just emphasizes something that I was talking about earlier, which is so central to the current dynamics of US politics, which is a movement of non-white working class voters away from the Democrats. Now, this is based on pre-election data, but actually it turned out the pre-election data was pretty accurate in terms of the trends against the Democrats among these kinds of groups. People were skeptical. They said it was a sampling problem, other problems. People being sampled were casting a protest vote against the Democrats, but they never vote against them. All turned out to be completely untrue. They did, in fact, not want to vote for the Democrats, and they did, in fact, in much larger numbers vote for Trump. So you see the margin, the compression here among non-white working class voters, but you can also see it among Black non-college. You can see it among Hispanic non-college, and even to a lesser degree among Asian non-college. So all these non-white groups, especially the working class, are becoming progressively less democratic, progressively more oriented or open to voting for, the sort of not their, what used to be their default party was the Democrats. That permission structure is falling apart. And now actually you now have a permission structure starting to be built that allows people to vote for the Republicans and, based on how their communities are swinging. And I think that's particularly the case for Hispanics. There's all kinds of famous stories about what's happened in the southern part of Texas, where communities that were like, plus 60 for Hillary Clinton now voted for Trump in the last election, right? I mean, massive swings. So that's what happens when sort of the community default toward a certain party starts to break down, and all of a sudden people realize, hey, I can consider the other side. I don't really like the people I've been voting for so long. I want to do something else. And I think blacks are sort of behind the curve on this, but I think it's happening. They're still the most loyal group, but I think we can already see considerable signs of attrition, particularly among males and particularly among working class voters. So let's look at the next slide. Okay, so one thing that's important to understand about how this is manifesting itself, this change, is it used to be the case that, you got your minority voters, you got your Hispanic voters, you got your Black voters. The fault is the Democrats, and it doesn't matter what their ideology is. They can be conservative, they can be moderate, they can be liberal. The Democrats will still get a really big premium because of that. But we can see that over time, non-white conservatives used to identify as Democrats, as this says here, but they're starting to move away from the Democrats and toward the Republicans. So this is the percentage of liberals, conservatives of each race who identify as Democrats, as I said. And, you basically are looking at how much, for example, how much did conservatives who are white or conservatives who are Asian, conservatives or Latino, this is a really interesting one. They used to really be, I've seen higher figures than this, not just 50%, but 60% voting Republican back in the day, voting Democratic back in the day. And you can see this just falls off a cliff. So there are very few Hispanic conservatives are now voting for the Democrats, whereas the Hispanic liberals are pretty stable. And the same thing is happening with other non-white groups. So in a sense, David Shore has emphasized this many times. People are starting to vote their ideology over their party, right? I mean, they have a certain sort of default assumption about what party they're going to vote for, but that default assumption is being weakened. So they're freer now to vote their underlying ideology. And these are basically moderate to conservative populations. There are very few liberals among Hispanics who identify as liberal. They mostly are moderate to conservative, about 80%. And they're now starting to manifest that in their voting pattern. So let's take a look at the next slide. So there's some data from David Shore, who just dropped a bunch of data. He's interviewed by Ezra Klein and by Eric Levitz. And this is from the big slideshow you can get online. But the interesting thing here is not just the conservatives who are now, swung from 16 to 24 in a way that is basically pro-Republican, but this line here, Hispanic moderates, 23-point margin decline for the Democrats between 2016 and 2024. And then what that shows you is not only are Hispanic conservatives now uninclined to vote for the Democrats, and are likely to vote for the Republicans, but more and more Hispanic moderates are acting like white moderates and are much more open to voting for the Republicans and voting for a candidate like Donald Trump. So that's very significant because, more Hispanic moderates and conservatives start acting like white moderates and conservatives, the closer those voting margins are going to be among Hispanics to the voting margins among whites. We're not quite there yet, but it could definitely happen in the future. And we're seeing trends that are consistent with that. So let's see the next slide. So one reason why this has happened is white voters have really changed, especially white voters who are Democrats. So this shows a famous racial resentment, so-called question that's been asked a million times in a million different surveys. And Irish, Italians, Jewish, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without special favors. And it used to be the case, who disagrees with that? Well, interestingly enough, there's actually, this applies, there's a lot of Blacks, even back in 1994, who would agree with this. But obviously, there's significant, a chunk disagreed. And there were much more than the white liberals who disagreed with the statement, right? So Blacks were more liberal coded on this question than than white liberals. But white liberals really change, starting in sort of the teens, the beginning of the Great Awakening, all the way through 2014 and 2016. I don't have data that goes beyond this, but that's the basic idea. You can see this in a lot of different state analyses that have been done. White liberals are now much more liberal on social questions like this than are non-whites, that are Blacks, that are Hispanics. They are the people basically waving the flag for a lot of the stuff that went under the rubric of the Black Lives Matter movement and all the sort of racial essentialism, racial reckoning, and all that. The people this affected the most were white liberals, who basically took that in and basically became almost drunk with virtue on how sort of progressive they were on all these issues. And what does that mean? Well, okay, let's take a look at the next slide. This has a big effect on the Democrats because the white liberals are all Democrats. And look at this chart. White adults who are Democrats, 26% were liberal in 1994, 61% 2021, 63% 2022. Don't have any later data. But what that tells you is pretty much all white Democrats are now liberals, right? 63%. That's a 37-point shift from 1994. So that means that these white Democrats, almost all of whom, 2/3 of whom are liberal, are just moving in a direction that, because of their influence of the Democratic Party, is going to move the party ever more to the left on questions that liberals care a lot about. So that tells you again a reason why some of these non-whites and other working class voters might find where the Democrats are going to their liking, because they don't have the same ideology, they don't have the same view of the world. So let's take a look at the next slide. Now, this is also from David Shore. And this shows it in the view of the 2024 electorate. 49% said Kamala Harris is more liberal than I am. In contrast, just 39% said Donald Trump is more conservative than I am. So this is the kind of thing that's hard for people who live in various liberal bubbles, and which, in all due respect, I would say Madison is probably an example. I'm a little hard to grasp. For like the median voter out there, particularly median working class voter, this is what they believe. They don't necessarily believe this. They believe that Donald Trump's views are close to their own. So that's something that Democrats have to reckon with. We're now perceived as being, well, the liberal college graduate party. So let's take a look at the next slide. But, Democrats are inclined to argue, are they not, that the problem is just turnout. I mean, yeah, okay, 2024 didn't go so well. These, reactionary working class voters are turning out in en masse. These Hispanic working class voters who are conservative and, affected by white supremacist ideology, they're the ones voting. What if everybody voted? What if more people voted? And this is a dirty little secret of the contemporary Democratic coalition. It benefits from low turnout. The lower turnout is, by and large, and we may see this in today's special election for state Supreme Court in Wisconsin, the lower the turnout, the better Democrats are likely to do relative to the electorate as a whole. And that's because the electorate as a whole is more conservative now. And the more people you get out to vote, the more those peripheral working class and non-white voters come out and cast their ballots, the worse Democrats are likely to do. So this is the estimate from Shore Blue Rose that shows that Trump won by about 1.5 points in the popular vote in 2024. If everyone had voted, this used to be the great Democratic dream of only all those, the unwashed masses would all show up at the polls. I mean, by God, we'd kick their ass. Well, that doesn't appear to be true, at least anymore. It never was true. Now, if everyone shows up, the Democrats, would just, submerge ever farther beneath the water, blub, blub, blub. So that's something that's very important to consider and think about when we consider where the Democrats are today. They got to figure out a way to reach peripheral and low information voters, because they will show up at some point. And right now, they are not, a point in your favor. So let's take a look at the next slide. So, well, this is stasis, but I want to stop here for a second and talk about why would this continue? Well, I think this might continue, the decline part of it, because Democrats don't seem too interested in changing their approach at this point. They're not too interested in moving to the center in cultural issues. They're not too interested in maybe managing to change their brand from being the party of the liberal college graduates. They just want to fight. AOC and Bernie Sanders are out there fighting the oligarchy. Ken Martin, who was elected head of the DNC, said we got a great message. We just have to figure out how to deliver it better. And by and large, there's a lot of resistance from changing the image of the party from what it is today in a big way by taking some actually different positions. And there is a interest in relying on what essentially will be a thermostatic reaction to the Trump administration. In other words, Trump is going to do some stuff that isn't going to work, and people aren't going to get what they want, and they're going to be mad. And they're going to say, well, maybe the Democrats weren't so bad. But that's a prescription for not arresting decline, but simply, basically achieving status. And if things don't go terribly for the Trump administration, it's hard to believe at this point. I mean, maybe things work out though. Maybe there's an slight economic decline, and then it picks up again. And by the time we get to 2028, things will be great. Now, Democrats don't change their image and approach and the things they stand for, and Trump actually seems to have done pretty well. That is a big problem, because then you're just going to see that decline continue. All these trends that I was rehearsing in the previous slides would probably continue to move in those basic directions. The Democrats would become ever more of a Brahmin left party, which is not a good arithmetic because there are many more working class voters than there are college educated voters. And you're basically then in a situation where I have to keep jacking up your share of the college graduate vote to make up for your losses among the working class. And in the end, that's a losing game. So, but stasis, I think, is probably more likely than continued decline, at least in a big way. And here's why. Let's take a look at the next slide. Why did people vote for Donald Trump, if you asked? This is an interesting chart from David Shore that is about basically taking issue importance versus, the margin of Democrats over Republicans or vice versa. And this quadrant here, notice it's much more crowded than the quadrant above, which is like, this is important. And I like the Republicans, I like the Democrats. There's many fewer things here than there are here. But what was, according to these data, important was, border security, immigration, crime, Republicans heavily favored, more trusted on those issues. And they are, somewhat important. They're on that side of this line. But what was most important? Inflation, the economy, cost of living. Those were the things that more than anything else drove people toward Donald Trump, the sense that Biden and Bidenomics and the Biden administration had no clue about this stuff. And they did not, find Bidenomics to their liking. They did not feel it was improving their standard of living. The inflation spike was terrible for the Democrats and just a general lack of faith in democratic economic management. So obvious solution for the Trumpsters, if they get in, will manage the economy better because that's what people elected us for and everything will be great. But let's see what's happening. Let's see the next slide. Okay, sort of connected to this, they were supposed to deliver change that improves Americans' lives. I mean, preserving American institutions, 18%, improve people's lives, 78%. So what this suggests is what's likely to kill the Trump administration isn't this line here about preserving American institutions, because people flat out don't think it's that important. I mean, they're worried about it, they care about it, but Democrats tend to assume that, especially educated Democrats, the things I'm upset about what Trump is doing are the same thing that working class voters are upset about. But that's not true. What they're interested in is improving my life. And also, another thing to keep in mind here, what do you agree with the most, even if none are exactly right? The thing that generated the strongest response in this data from Shore is things in America are going poorly, and what is needed is a major change and a shock to the system whoever becomes president. So again, that's something Trump has done. And people probably like that. They like the idea of a shock to the system. But what do they want? They want change that improves my life. So let's look at the next slide. Okay, this is very recent data from the CBS News poll, one of the better media polls out there. Okay, what do you think the Trump administration is doing, Mr. and Ms. Ordinary Voter? What about low prices? Too much? No. Right amount? Not doing enough, 64%. That's where people's heads are at. I elected you, Donald Trump, and the Republicans to lower prices. I'm not seeing it yet. And what do they think about tariffs? Well, they think basically there's too much emphasis on tariffs. And compare the 64 to the 55. People understand it rightly. There's been a huge emphasis on the tariff regime, whatever it may be. Tomorrow's Liberation Day. So, that's pretty exciting. I think we all looking forward to seeing what kind of tariffs there really are. And the golden age will begin, as Trump put it memorably in one of his addresses. But, average Americans aren't too, we've done enough. It's just enough. I don't get it. I don't understand what it's going to do for me. Just lower my prices, please. So let's take a look at the next one. Now, expectations versus now. Trump's policies are making you financially. So before, our beloved president took office, there was a plurality in favor of the idea they're going to make me financially better off. Now, a plurality in favor, they're going to make me worse off. And you can see this in pretty much every basic, plain vanilla economic question that's asked. What do you think about the state of the economy? What do you think about your personal finances? What do you think about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? They're all pretty negative. Now, in defense of the Trump administration, they're not much worse than they were under Biden, in some cases a little bit better, but they're still very negative. He's not making the sale in terms of actually improving the economy in a way that ordinary Americans understand. So let's look at the next one. And what do people think about the impact of tariffs on prices? We saw that people think he's doing too much on tariffs. He's not doing enough in lowering prices. Well, in the short term, people expect tariffs overwhelmingly to increase prices. And even over the long term, a strong plurality is that they'll increase prices, not decrease prices. So this is a big problem. He's spending a lot of political capital on doing something that is not responsive to why he was elected, right? And voters not only don't believe it's going to work out, in the real world, there's a really excellent chance it will not work out. And already we've seen signs of economic problems in the stock market, so on and so forth. So let's see the next slide. So, and this just shows you how people feel in general. I mean, this actually, so inflation, he's minus 12 underwater on inflation. He's plus 6 in immigration. That basically shows you the good side and the bad side in terms of public opinion of how he's been doing. They like a lot of the immigration stuff. They give him a good rating, therefore deporting legal immigrants, especially those who commit crimes and so on and so forth. Now there's a whole controversy around some of the non-citizens who have green cards and citizens or whatever. I don't think people are too happy about that, but the general concept of getting rid of illegal immigrants from the country, particularly those who have participated in or associated with wrongdoing, is extremely popular and still is to this day. So next slide. This is a slide from Shore that shows basically what we might expect to redound to the advantage of the GOP and which would actually hurt them. As the byline up there says, he's got a lot of popular policies, but the least popular policies are those that have to do with benefits, cutting federal spending and direct services, imposing tariffs that would produce costs. I mean, things people like, no tax on Social Security, require voter ID, military border deployment. This is an interesting one, increased drilling and fossil fuel production. I can't emphasize how important this is. Democrats are under a terrible delusion that running against fossil fuels is like really popular. It's not. You know, people like solar, people like renewables, but at the end of the day, if you ask them, do you think we should have more or less, fossil fuel production? People say, yeah, sure. I mean, it's basically the American public, and especially the median working class voters, in all of the above space. So no one should kid themselves that the Republicans are going down the tubes because they're basically increasing fossil fuel production. That's not going to be the case. But what don't they like about the Republicans? Medicaid cuts, closing federal funding. And here's, of course, the real third rail, Social Security and Medicare. So I think a lot of Democrats are anticipating that the reconciliation bill Republicans are cooking up is going to be forced to cut entitlements, particularly Medicaid, but also possibly other things. And, there's all kinds of loose talk about privatizing Social Security. I don't take that seriously, but I do think it makes a great talking point for the Democrats. And that's kind of the issue landscape for the Democrats and Republicans right now. So let's take a look at the next slide. So yeah, I guess I should talk a little bit about advance, but I hope what I just showed explains to you why stasis is really the most likely outcome here. It's been a number of decades now. We've got back and forth between the parties, switching control of Congress, pretty narrow majorities, pretty polarized country. Basically, one party comes in after the other party's negative points become very salient. Then it's followed by the other party getting in because the incumbent party's negative points become salient. But nothing really, the fundamental structure of politics doesn't change. The electoral terrain really doesn't shift that much. I wrote a piece called Politics Without Winners, a big report with my colleague at AEI, Yuval Levin, where we tried to lay out that dynamic and how it almost seems like neither party in our current system is really that interested in creating a broad, durable majority. They're not practicing politics like they can make that happen. And in fact, they're not making it happen. And so I think that's why, if we look at what Trump's doing and how the Democrats are likely to respond to it, I think the most likely event is that Democrats will take advantage of the thermostatic reaction against the Trump administration, particularly as it affects the economy. And there are some other things people don't like, and they basically won't change very much. I mean, they'll basically be the same party, maybe a little bit more moderate on social issues, let's talk more about the working class, fight, and, down with the oligarchy. But it's fundamentally going to be the same party with basically the same brand. However, if Trump basically screws up enough, that will not prevent them from getting back into power. I do expect them to take the House in 2026. Senate, I think, is hard. 2028, anything's possible. But I think even if the Democrats put in a good showing, it's not clear it's going to be enough to beat the other side. And even if it does, it won't be conclusive. So it's just a long roundabout way of saying we may see just more of the same politics. Very polarized, very small sort of margins for each party, even when you get into power, and a continuing inability to solve our nation's problems. Okay, how can Democrats advance from this situation? Well, I think back to being a Brahmin left party. And if you look at this chart, and imagine it's now up here somewhere, right? I mean, that it's basically a highly dependent on the votes of college-educated voters, and ever more unattractive to working class voters who feel this is not their party. Democrats haven't really produced for me. Their whole way of looking at the world is not my way of looking at the world. They're not my values. They're down on me. Fuck those guys. The way to basically you got to start turning this around. You got to start moving this chart back down in this direction, right? You got to make it less of a Brahmin left party. You got to reduce the polarization between college educated and non-college educated voters. You got to start doing a lot better among working class voters. And by doing, if you have to lose a point or two off your college graduate margin, so be it. But I think that's the choice they have to make. So next slide. And again, this revisits some of the fundamental problems. You got to do something about not only this white working class margin, but the non-white working class margin. If this continues, as I alluded to earlier, it really does undercut everything the Democrats are planning to do, and the majorities they hope to put together. I mean, this is a death knell here. This line, this third row in the chart. They've got to stop the bleeding among non-white working class voters. Full stop. And of course, they might want to do something about the youths. As, wasn't that in My Cousin Vinny? You got to do something about the youths because they're not happy with us anymore. So that's another thing they've got to do. Next slide. And we're talking about brand. We're talking about how do people look at the Democratic Party today, and how does it need to change? Well, this is some interesting data from, again, Bern Murdoch of the Financial Times. What do people think about the Democratic Party they like? Well, back in the day, a pretty large number of people would say off the top of the head, they represent the working class. So it just pretty much consistent secular decline in the number of people who say, I think the Democrats represent the working class. Standing up for marginalized groups starts very small, and now basically is higher than standing up representing the working class. Of course, they're good in healthcare. And out of left field, nobody used to associate the Democrats with climate change. And now a lot of people they're good in climate change. Great. Excellent. Too bad it's not a salient issue, but Democrats are viewed as being good on climate change much more than we used to be. So next slide. And this is a very interesting slide. It's, arguably the slide, the iconic slide from the 2024 election. And this basically, charts the income vote share, high minus low income, and the education vote share gap, degree minus non-degree. So this here, low education, low income, you've got advantages on both of those buckets. That used to be the Democratic Party we knew and loved. I mean, it's the oppressed masses who wanted to vote for the Democratic Party. And the last time we had anything like that was, well, Clinton was like that, but Obama in 2012, his coalition did skew in that direction. But ever since then, we've seen the Democrats, and they had to stop an high education, low income limit, right? Biden and Hillary Clinton. And now Kamala Harris in 2024 basically had advantage among both educated and affluent voters. They were the educated affluent voter party. And what does this most look like? The Dole coalition of 1996. So, put your mind around that. The Democrats coalition in some key ways now resembles more the Dole coalition of 1996 than it does the Clinton coalition of 1996. So that's pretty amazing. And as this chart here that I think was put in by Ruffini, in this half of the chart, you lose 7 of 8 elections. This side of the chart, you won 7 of 8 elections. So something's gone very wrong when we're in the wrong quadrant. So tell all your friends, let's get out of the bad quadrant and into the good quadrant. But the trend is not encouraging, as you can see from looking at this line here. The Harris 2024 coalition should be the terminus of Democratic decline. But as I was alluding to earlier, it might not be. So that's why you have to make a conscious effort to start moving this back in a different direction and more consciously and purposefully appeal to the kind of voters you've been losing, and not assume that just the thermostatic reaction against the Trump administration will, in the medium to long term, be sufficient to reawaken those voter loyalties. I think that's a mistake, and we could see that in a lot of things, not just the election results, but the party identification stuff too. So the next slide. So this is a reminder of what has to change. Where are the Democrats doing great? Well, if you live in a state that has a bachelor's degree attainment rate of 40% or more, you can pretty much be sure the Democrats are doing great. And they got like a ton of senators. Oh, fantastic. The problem is there's only 12 of these states. It's like a tiny sliver of the United States. But let's look at the next slide. Oh, different. Well, this shows all the states with a state bachelor's degree attainment rate of under 35%. And of all these many, 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 many states, there's only one state, New Mexico, where the Democrats prevailed in the 2024 presidential election. And just think about this from the standpoint of the Senate, where the Democrats just really, their chances of taking back the Senate anytime soon are not good. They're not good in 2026. They're not even good in 2028, even if they win the presidential. And it's because all these low education states have become increasingly red, increasingly hostile to Democrats, are states where the Democratic brand is toxic. And it's just going to be really hard to assemble enough Democratic senators from these states to really finally get you over the 50 state, well, of course, to the 60 state margin, 60 state caucus ideally. But, it's hard not to look at this map and not think, what happened to when Democrats used to have Democratic senators in a lot of these states? Florida, Texas, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa. I mean, it's mind-boggling. Missouri. I mean, it just doesn't happen anymore. Not only does it not happen, nobody even thinks it's going to happen anytime soon. So that suggests we got to start thinking less about the college graduates and more about the people who are not college graduates, i.e., e.g., to wit, the working class. So let's look at the next slide. So there's many, many things that could be said about how the Democrats should approach this quandary, this challenge. So my test is, what would the working class say? I wrote a piece about this in my Substack the other day. What would the working class say? What would the working class say test is not hard to do, but it does entail getting outside of the liberal college educated bubble. I'm looking at you guys. So many Democrats live within, particularly as experience on social media and activist circles, and within advocacy, nonprofit, media, and academic institutions. I have a peculiar feeling I'm in one of those right now. And let's face it, you guys are part of the problem. I don't mean to be mean about this, but I just think it's true. Working class voters, we have to remember, they're less ideological. They're more focused on material concerns. They're more likely to be struggling economically. They're less interested in cutting edge social issues. They're more patriotic, and they're just generally more culturally conservative on every vector, the whole vector of cultural issues on which the Democrats have moved very significantly to the left in the last 15 years. So let's look at the next slide. So this continues our test. So my takeaway from that, doing the test, is If the test indicates that Democrats are advocating or saying something that's likely unpopular, off-putting, or just lacks salience with working class people, and I'll just maybe check the climate change issue here again, that policy or rhetoric is probably on the wrong track. Conversely, if the test indicates that working class people are likely to view what Democrats are advocating, saying it's desirable, in tune with their values, actually important to their everyday lives, remember that? That is a very good sign. So this is not a complicated test, but I actually am convinced that if Democratic activist leaders, whatever, the rank and file, they just kept this in mind when they're thinking about what the Democrats should stand for, and whether or not they should change some of the things they currently seem to stand for, and some of the current things they seem to advocate. Do this test. Think about it. And is this really going to happen? Let's look at the last slide. The Democrats pass this test. Are they going to move toward cultural moderation? Are they going to sort of advocate some sort of agenda that has to do with abundance that ordinary people want? In other words, it's not necessarily what ordinary people aren't interested in is sort of like a socially liberal ecotopia, which is, I think, sometimes the vision of what Democrats have for abundance. You can read the introduction to the Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson book, and that's basically what they're talking about. You wake up and the sun is out and it's powering your house, and a gentle breeze blows through the window, and you go out and get in your electric car, and blah blah blah. So I don't think that's what people think of by abundance. They want more stuff. They want prices to be under control. They want to see their living standards going up rapidly. They want it to be cheap and easy to get stuff. So just in terms of energy, that's what they're interested in: cheap, reliable, abundant energy. They could care less where it comes from. Okay, and patriotism. People love their country. This is one of the reasons why Democrats have tanked with Hispanics. Hispanics are an incredibly patriotic, upwardly mobile, community-oriented community. And they just, they're gobsmacked by a lot of this like anti-American kind of vibe they get out of a lot of Democratic liberals. Oh, we're so sorry we did all these terrible things. We're still a terrible country today. I apologize to you today for you having to wake up in this racist dystopia or hellhole. That is absolutely no purchase with these voters. They want a party that is obvious and convincing and authentic about how they love their country, and they believe it has done good things and will do even better things in the future. So, it's a tough test, to hit all these three things, I think. And my view, I'm going to be honest with you, is, next slide, an unequivocal maybe. I just don't know. I could think of a lot of reasons why it isn't going to work. And I think there's some reasons why it might. That's why we play the game and they count the votes, right? But right now we are in this maybe situation. Nothing is settled. Could be disaster looming on the horizon, or bright sunshine in the future. We just don't know. So I'll leave you with that thought, I guess, and entertain some questions.
I can see how there are actually individuals out there who are politicians who are moderating the cultural resistance. So patriotic, the abundance thing. How do you actually affect that? How do you actually get energy prices cheaper? How do you get other prices cheaper? There's all this talk about how the president does that, but the truth is that it's not really in his or her hands so much. What do you think about that?
Well, the abundance people would argue that by getting a lot of obstacles out of the way to getting stuff done, getting stuff built, including energy infrastructure and lots of other things, that will actually produce more cheaper housing, for example, which is like a huge deal for a lot of people. The supply of housing is extremely terrible in this country, but a lot of it does have to do with regulations and permitting and permits and all kinds of other problems to prevent the market from providing what people want. So this is really the heart. I mean, probably one of the main things that motivates some of these abundance advocates like Klein and Thompson is they think the housing problem is unbelievably terrible. And the only way you can fix that is by getting some of these regs out of the way and zoning reform and things like that. So that would provide lower prices in a key area. Another aspect of this is whenever a public project is done that's supposed to make people's life easier, funded, if you will, provide them with services that'll make their life better. It takes forever to do it. And frequently it doesn't get done. So this is another way in which we aren't providing the abundance that people need. In terms of energy, the cheapest way to get cheap energy is just increase the supply. I mean, we're going to need more and more energy. And if the supply runs below demand, as it might with the rise of data centers and things like that, energy will become more expensive. And by and large, the record is not good for moving aggressively toward putting a bigger renewables mix in an electrical grid. It does not lower prices as a rule. It tends to increase them. You could argue that there's ways in which that might not happen. The problem is it does happen. And it's not a prescription for cheap energy prices. It's just not. It's a prescription for, according to the people who are into it, it's a way of doing something about climate change. But people don't care about climate change. This is a third tier issue for working class people. If you could, whatever you do, provided you provide, cheap electricity and, whatever else, whatever car they choose to drive is cheap and easy to drive, and all the other inputs that are as part of their daily life are cheaper and better, more convenient, they're totally happy. But the extent it interferes with that, they're not happy. So that's the deal. I mean, you want in a way, it gets back to what with the working class test. I mean, if you're going to provide abundance, the working class will recognize and enjoy as such, not what you recognize as abundance. I mean, there was an interesting interview with Ezra Klein by Oren Cass, who's head of this sort of heterodox conservative think tank called American Economist, said he asked, basically is pushing Ezra on, well, you put a lot of emphasis in this, your book on clean energy. I mean, this is what's really going to allow clean energy to be built out fast enough to really do something about climate change. We got to get rid of all the things standing in the way, the obstacles, the roadblocks. And if we do that, before you can say Jack Robinson will have a ton of renewable energy, and that'll be great. And of course, Cass said, well, don't you think there are trade-offs here? I mean, yeah, you might accelerate the development of renewable energy, but maybe it would not actually be good for energy prices and other problems. And don't you think there's a trade-off? And wouldn't that not be abundance then? And basically he said, but my idea of abundance, and particularly of energy abundance, is clean energy abundance. That's what abundance means to me. I mean, he pretty much said that. Well, okay, that's great, but that's not what abundance means to a normal American voter, because they don't care that much about climate change. They care about material realities of the energy that they consume. They're just not as animated as, liberals, coastal elite liberals like Ezra Klein are. So I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind. Abundance is a great idea, but in and of itself, it can be implemented in a lot of different ways. And you have to be careful about whose priorities you're actually following when you do that. It's not a magic elixir, because you may wind up providing people with abundance they don't even recognize as abundance. Not to mention it'll be pretty hard. I mean, there's all kinds of problems with that whole economic program, starting with the fact that the democratic universe is full of NGOs, activists, and other highly influential actors who have zero interest in any kind of abundance agenda. They don't really want to do something about regulation. They don't want to do something that would forestall litigation. They think, well, this stuff is great. They want more. They basically, there are literally parts of the democratic, NGO industrial complex who say the solution to the problem of excessive regulation is not doing anything about the regulations. It's we should have more bureaucrats, so we could process things faster. That's the solution. I mean, you can't believe people believe this stuff, but they do. So I just think it's going to be a heavy lift for any kind of abundance agenda in the Democratic Party. And even if they decide they're going to do it, they might not do it right. So that's one reason why, an unequivocal maybe, whether the Democrats are going to be able to recover in any significant way anytime soon.
So regulation, we shouldn't just let Rio Tinto tear apart the North Slope without looking at water quality.
It seems like a loaded question. No, I mean, of course, we're not saying get rid of all regulations. We're saying to do projects in this country that have anything to do with anything substantial. Yeah, it includes mining, it includes lots of other things. It includes transportation infrastructure, it includes energy infrastructure, it includes housing. There is an excessive amount of regulations and regulatory steps that have to be gone through and too much opportunities for litigation by, interested parties, so-called stakeholders, that basically you never are able to get things done. So there are ways of streamlining these systems. So it's not like there's no regulations, but there are just far fewer, and it's far easier to get exceptions to the regulations. It's far easier to fast track things through the regulatory structure. You reduce the opportunities for litigation. I mean, lots of people have written about this, and it's as easy enough to find. So the choice is not between, or shouldn't be between, the regulatory structure we have now and no regulations. I wouldn't advocate that, but I think frequently that's how it's put, because I think, again, for a lot of people, I mean, you can worry reasonably enough about, well, if you didn't have any regulations, all this terrible stuff would happen. But there is, as it were, a middle ground that would be a significant improvement over where we are now, and would allow the U.S. to move forward economically and in terms of responding to the needs of its citizens and actually building stuff than we have today.
I just wanted to ask, so how much maneuverability do you think the Democratic Party realistically has on fixing its brand on the cultural issues? Because, I mean, even if the Democratic Party moves its own messaging, it's still in this ecosystem of progressive activists. And so I could envision a situation where in 2028, whoever the presidential candidate is runs on a fairly moderate cultural agenda, but there's still an association with, whatever the campus protesters are doing at the moment.
Sure.
And so isn't there a fairly big chance that if the Democratic Party moves, it basically just, people won't buy it, and it'll sort of be losing out on its base while simultaneously failing to capture working class voters?
Well, it's a good question. Part of that is, how easy do we think it will be for any Democratic candidate or set of candidates to actually move in a significantly more moderate direction, because of all the pressures that will be on them not to do that. And if they do that, they'll get attacked. So personally, I think that's inevitable. I think you will be attacked. And I would argue, in terms of your question about would working class voters or more moderate voters, would they believe this? The very fact that you would be attacked if you did something ostentatious is actually a good thing, because that's what signals to these voters you're serious. The crazies in your party are attacking you, and you're basically saying, fuck you. It's like Bill Clinton and Sister Souljah in 1992. I mean, that is part of where Democrats haven't been willing to go. They've been willing to say some things that seem a little bit more moderate, but they haven't really been willing to essentially be very aggressively break from previous positions, say those previous positions were wrong, and the people who still hold these positions are wrong. And, I'm not going to back down. It's hard to do in the contemporary Democratic Party. I think one of the easiest things for Democrats to say now is, for example, well, now that you mention it, border security is kind of important. We might have been a little bit too lax on that. But it's one thing to say that. It's another thing to full-throatedly denounce the Biden immigration policy and basically say, you know what, I don't like the way Donald Trump is doing some of these deportations, but some of them are necessary. We should be deporting some people. Remember, Obama was a deporter in chief, and now Democrats are very much afraid to go there. So, Fetterman was one of the only people who showed up to the signing of the Riley Act and when it was passed through Congress. He's one of the only people who's been willing to say publicly that, it's a no-brainer. Of course we should deport violent illegal immigrants. Very few Democrats are willing to say that. And Fetterman is really getting a lot of blowback now for being so heterodox, for saying stuff so directly and boldly about how his party has some stupid positions. But I think there have to be more politicians to do that, and politicians who are going to be more saleable throughout the party and have more serious political ambitions. I think Fetterman is, I think he's hit his seal. Democrat, senator from Pennsylvania. I don't think he's going to run for president. But what about the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro? He's an interesting case because he has been willing to say some things that are somewhat unorthodox. Famously, he rebuilt I-95, but part of it fell apart in 12 days because he got rid of a lot of these bullshit regs that were getting in the way of getting it done. and he just got it done. He said, we got to build stuff. Might have used a stronger word. But so, that's kind of the right idea, but actually like pushing that aggressively and standing your ground is quite another thing. In fact, you probably need not just a sister soldier moment, but a series of 5 or 6 of them, right? And who's going to be the politician that's going to do that? I think, we'll see if one emerges between now and 2028. And when you do that, you basically make the bet. You say, by doing this, I'm going to make people understand I'm a different kind of Democrat. And the image you have of Democrats, that's the past, this is the future, this is where I am now. And there are going to be some people who aren't going to like it, but the net of this is going to be good for the Democratic Party. I'm going to gain more from the people in the middle and disaffected working class voters than I'm going to lose from some, super liberal college graduates in Brooklyn who aren't going to vote for me. I mean, they won't vote for the other side, but they'll just stay at home or whatever. So, there's always trade-offs, but to my mind, this is a trade-off that is not only worth making, it has to be made to arrest this continuing secular decline of the Democratic Party as a working class party.
Your scenario sort of suppose that the voter has accurate information. How do we balance a review of what the Democrats do with what they actually do? And I'm thinking about still refer to Lifeline as an Obama phone when that wasn't an Obama program. People talking about Badger Care Plus, which is Medicaid for Wisconsin families, which was a Tommy Thompson program as a Democrat handout, right? Junior talking about Medicaid premiums being too high when it's an absolutely free program. So doesn't some of the progress that you're suggesting kind of depend on the ability to accurately say what's happening? How does that?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that it's going to be true in any political situation. Your opponents will misrepresent your positions, and they will seek to misrepresent them in such a way as to disadvantage you. So, but on the other hand, you're going to do the same thing to them. I mean, misinformation, quote unquote, is not a problem just for one side of the spectrum. I think both sides indulge in it. And at the end of the day, I think voters are surprisingly attuned to where different parties are coming from in terms of the very general positions on things, their very general priorities. Do they know the policy ins and outs of a lot of programs? They do not. Do they ever bother to read any party's platform? They do not. But they do have a general sense of where Democrats are coming from, where Republicans are coming from. So I don't think the solution to the Democrats' image problems or brand problems is somehow trying to sort of somehow pour correct information into the ears of peripheral voters who might be getting some information that is incorrect. It's rather to try to come up with compelling messages that are easy to understand, and that part of that is basically transmitting the idea you are a different kind of Democrat. There are some things Democrats have been accused of. They're completely accurate. It's not like the only problem with Democrats is misinformation is mooted about their programs, and people are misinformed. In fact, some of the things Democrats have done were bad. Some of the things Democrats stand for are not good. Therefore, you need to change the positions, not just how you talk about things, or provide people with better and more correct information. I think that's a somewhat comforting way for some Democrats to look at it. If just we could get the right information to people, that would do the trick. I don't believe that's the case. I just don't.
Yeah. We've got a few questions from the people watching online.
Okay.
So I'll read out 3. So the first one is from Professor Howard Winand, and he asks, more than 90 million eligible voters did not vote in 2024. That is the winning party, exceeding either the Dem or Republican vote. How can the Dems bring these people to the polls? What does this say about the meaningfulness of the data you present? Thanks. Dana Maltby also asks, if the Democratic Party continues this decline, what's the likelihood of a Workers' Party or a Socialist Party coming in and keeping in? And finally, Dan Wang says, outside of, say, the cultures 30% of Trump's base, many 2024 Trump voters were just fed up with the quote unquote normal way of running the country. As the 50+ percentage favorability for shock change stat showed, what would be a clear left disruptive shock argument, brand or message? So is the Bernie brand of, for example, 99% versus the 0.1%, as you say, salient with non-degreed voters?
Well, a non-voting one, I thought I kind of talked about that if you actually had a situation in which everybody voted at this particular point in time, the Democrats would lose more badly. So all of the trends that I was talking about in the first part of this presentation would probably be even more compelling, even more stark. So I would say that the general pattern of results that I alluded to would in fact be reinforced by if those non-voters showed up to vote. Now, the magic assumption typically of people who still believe in the turnout mobilization and mobilization theory is, well, okay, we're going to make it so that more people vote, and we're going to make sure that the more people who vote are our people. And the people who don't support us are going to be the people who continue to stay at home. And that is just magical thinking. If you have a more, a more compelling and polarized and intense campaign environment, you will get more peripheral voters to the voting poll, and you cannot control who those voters are. You cannot determine which non-voters get the vote. In all likelihood, you will be drawing from that vast pool, and that vast pool is in fact not friendly to you. So, the non-voter party at this point, such as it is a party that's more available to the Republicans and the Democrats. So I think it just underscores a lot of the points that I was making. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of disaffected working class voters, but I think the chances of there being a third or workers' party in this country is just very small, given the structural electoral obstacles to having a third party. They're typically very limited in what they can do. Now, Joel is looking at me, and I should probably at least mention fusion as a possibility where, it would be a little bit easier for third parties to make a mark because it wouldn't be a lot harder for people to waste their vote and they'd be more interested. But by and large, I think the future of a specific workers' party in the United States, and certainly a socialist party, is pretty small. Socialist for sure. I mean, don't believe any of that stuff you see in the polls about how some surveys show people are kind of like socialism or not. They're not as hostile to it as you might think. It's basically death to run in the United States as a socialist in any kind of important, election. I mean, Bernie Sanders can get away with it because it's Bernie Sanders. But, if AOC gets a nomination in 2028 and she runs as a socialist, she will not actually, but she will be reminded that she said she was. That'll hurt her. I mean, parenthetically, that would be a terrible idea. She was a 2028 Democratic candidate. Talk about decline. I think we continue going down that road. But yeah, I mean, for better or worse, we're just not set up to have a workers' party. If we had a proportional representation system, systems are more like they have in Europe, possibly you could have a left, kind of probably an eco-socialist kind of party. I bet it'd be kind of greenish and socialist and more power to you, but it's not going to happen here. The shock to the system, I mean, Trump's providing the shock to the system. Would the left be able to provide a shock to the system? And specifically mentioned in the question was, is it possible that the Bernie type of thing, Bernie and AOC are out there, having big rallies, famously in Denver and other places, and AOC warms up the crowd, and then Bernie comes out there and the billionaire class, I mean, he hasn't really changed his shtick very much, but I think it's landing much better than it used to be just because people are so pissed off. And there's enough of these kind of folks who'll show up at a rally like that. But I don't think that's a shock to the system. I think that's just, rhetorically, it's just preaching to the faithful. I mean, it doesn't mean a shock to the system when you do that. You're basically saying, get Democrats back in so that the bad oligarchic people won't control stuff anymore. And then, at the end of the day, you're really just talking about switching parties. The party hasn't changed. The party's brand is the same. You're just saying that somehow, trust me, I'm Bernie Sanders. If enough of us rise up and we'll turn the turn the Democratic Party into a workers' party. We'll crush the billionaire class. And I think that's a less a shock to the system than a pipe dream. I just have to be told that's going to happen. You want to shock the system, you got to be a really different kind of Democrat and come in and do stuff really differently than Democrats are used to doing. And it wouldn't just be talking about fighting the oligarchy.
It strikes me that there are two interconnected parts to your argument. And the first one, which I think is less developed in this talk, but which you've covered more in your written work, is the story about the Democrats slowly abandoning the working class through its change in economic policy over a long period of time. That is to say that it slowly moves towards the center on economic policy. And the second argument being that it's become radicalized on cultural policy. And first of all, it strikes me that the places that you say that the Democratic Party is out of touch with the majority of voters are on primarily cultural issues. So in your latest book, I think there's particularly 4 areas you identify. So like policing, immigration, climate, and transgender politics.
Mhm.
Now, the climate one can be framed in economic terms around the Green New Deal, but for the most part, these are broadly cultural factors, elements of cultural ideology. Is it the case, though, that could you just have the first part of the argument without the second?
The cultural moment, as we used to say back in this hallowed Graduate School, the relative autonomy of the cultural moment. It's not all just reduced to economics. Culture has a life of its own. It's very important how people view politicians and what they're offering, whether they feel like that politician shares their values and is going to respect their way of life. These cultural things are huge. They have a big influence on how people live and how they view the political parties. So I do not, in fact, think it's enough for the Democrats to just try to get right on economics or become more sterner about their denunciations of the billionaire class or what have you, or even maybe somewhat better. I mean, what does it mean? Look, the Democrats, in a sense, lost track of the white working class and changed their economic image quite a bit in the late part of the 20th century when they kind of bought into what was at that point the general neoliberal consensus and all kinds of everything from deregulation and financials to trade and, their ongoing economic processes. To some extent, they were inevitable, but they didn't try to do much about them. And they lost, a lot of working class people lost faith that Democrats were the agents of prosperity. There's a famous Gallup quote, Gallup question that's been asked for like 80 years. In the next few years, which party do you think can best provide prosperity for the country? And up until the time of Ronald Reagan, Democrats usually had a big double-digit advantage on that, sometimes really big. And ever since then, it's been back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. And over the course of the 21st century, Republicans have a pretty standard advantage on this question. So Democrats are long viewed, and it's much worse among working class people. This is just aggregate. So if you look at working class voters within that universe, they're much less convinced that Democrats can, very more convinced that Republicans can. So there's a default, in a sense, assumption among working class people that Republicans are basically better for the economy than Democrats. So how do you push back against that? I'm not sure Democrats have figured it out. I mean, Bidenomics was supposed to do that, right? I mean, they came in after the 2020 election, which was a lot closer than they thought, and they kind of took a lot of pages from the Warrenite and Sanders book about how to approach economics. There was this sort of evolving anti-neoliberal consensus within certain parts of the Democratic economic establishment. And they said, well, hell, we're just gonna go for it. We're gonna spend a lot of money. We're gonna try to do a lot of things. And people will love it because it'll make their lives so much better. Well, it didn't make their lives better. That's the problem. I mean, the last 4 years have really hurt the Democrats' reputation as economic managers. The Democrats, like, they couldn't believe it. We did all this stuff. I mean, there was the Jobs and Infrastructure Act. There was a Chips and Science Act. There was a so-called Inflation Reduction Act. We spent a ton of money. But the people don't care if you spend a ton of money if their cost of living is going through the roof and they don't see the results in their own community. Most people did not, even though, of course, it did in some places. But, the Democratic reputation for economic management is poor at this point. So you don't repair that by running on a more robust or populist economic program. You basically have to figure out how to get into office, which it basically means you have to respond to these cultural issues and convince people that you are in fact on their side and you don't look down on them and you're part of the world, same world they're a part of. And then you can actually proceed to try to improve people's economic situation by pursuing whatever policies you feel are appropriate, which, back to the abundance people would include, taking a run at some of the regulatory and permitting obstacles and other bottlenecks that currently exist in the economy that prevent things from getting done. And then, then you got the positive feedback loop between governance and voting, more governance and more voting. So I don't think we're there yet. So I think, yeah, it's true that many politicians tried not to talk about some of the ways in which the party, and particularly the left of the party, had gone off the rails in terms of crime, immigration, gender, policing, race, and what have you. But it was indelibly associated with the Democratic Party because those people are on the Democratic Party side of the spectrum. I mean, even if they didn't talk about it, they didn't wave the defund the police flag, they weren't exactly saying, I think that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. And cops are basically good. And this whole Black Lives Matter thing is kind of an exaggeration. In fact, they're unarmed. Cops are not shooting down unarmed Black men on the street like willy-nilly. I mean, no one was willing to say that because part of the zeitgeist was you had to agree that there was this, sort of genocide on the streets by cops against Black men. And it was ludicrous. The data never supported that. So in other words, there's quite a difference between not endorsing some stupid thing the left says and being dissociated from it truly. That's much harder to do. It requires a different type of politics.